This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast, where I'm speaking to journalist and host of the Climate Cuisine podcast, Clarissa Wei. On her podcast, Clarissa shares the stories of the crops grown sustainably around the world. The goal is to highlight climate-centric conversations about crops and the food that we eat as they become increasingly important to the resiliency and survival of our food systems. I asked Clarissa to begin by talking about her background and the podcast.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a freelance journalist based in Taiwan, and sustainability, or the topic of eating foods according to your climate, has always sort of been a hobby for mine. I rent a plot on the outskirts of Taipei where my husband and I have a little food forest, and I've taken a lot of permaculture courses in the past. And just from all of these experiences, I've always thought that the conversation of eating local or eating organic can be pushed a little bit further to eating and growing what grows really well in one's climate. And so that was sort of just the inspiration for the podcast. I've been a food writer for a decade now, and obviously writing about food and food culture. I think a lot of people now are aware of the effects of climate change and just capitalism on where our food comes from, but not a lot of people are really thinking about their location, where they are in the world, and what crops thrive there.
Yeah, so before we move on to all the positive things people are doing, I wondered if you might just give a brief overview of what you think is wrong with the way we currently farm and consume.
Yep.
Where is that system falling down?
If you go to any grocery store, any multinational grocery store in the world, you'll see that there's, one type of banana, maybe a couple types of apples, and our diets are quite limited. I grew up in Los Angeles, and even moving here to Taiwan, the grocery stores look exactly the same, even though it's a completely different culture, it's a completely different climate. And it makes sense because for these farms and companies, you just grow things in bulk and then you ship it to your customers around the world. But that doesn't necessarily make sense, because what grows well in the UK is very different than what grows well in Taiwan. And so what I hope to do with my podcast is really to just have people be a little bit more present and think about where they are in the world and what grows well there.
Yeah, you talk about bananas in one of your episodes. What are the problems that are involved in having one particular variety of food?
Yeah, so there are over 1,000 types of bananas. And here in Taiwan, I'm growing like 5 different types. But most grocery stores around the world just stock the Cavendish because it's a banana that transports very easily. But it's not necessarily the banana with the best flavor. And the problem with this is that these giant monoculture farms are very susceptible to diseases. And this actually happened a couple generations prior, where back then the dominant banana was the Gros Michel, and a disease wiped out all of these bananas. So that's why you can't really see it anymore. And then they came up with the Cavendish. And now the same problem is happening again, where a disease is wiping out all the Cavendish. And as a consumer, you don't really think of this. You just go to the grocery store and see a banana. But after moving here to the subtropics and learning about different varieties of bananas, I realized that this conversation can be expanded a little bit more, and there's just much more than what we see in our grocery stores.
Yeah, definitely. So you live in Taiwan at the moment. If you want to get stuff with more local flavour, where can you go to get it? Or are you just having to grow it yourself?
Yeah, I just tap into a lot of things myself. I had the really cool opportunity with living with an indigenous chef here in Taiwan a couple of years ago. And she taught me about a lot of the edible plants here. The beauty of being in the tropics is that we have vibrant green produce all year round. And there are things that just grow wild that we can eat. But because Taiwan is an island that has been colonized by the Chinese and the Japanese and the Dutch, we have lost a lot of this knowledge. And it's the same thing that has happened also in the United States. A lot of these traditional plants or knowledge have been lost because of waves of colonization.
If we were to embrace the idea of growing food locally and growing food that was specifically suited to the climate where it was.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of suppose it's got a two-pronged thing. It widens your food choices, but it also narrows them seasonally, I suppose. So thinking about that, what do we as consumers need to change in terms of our buying habits in order for this system to work?
I think a lot of it is actually minimalizing and simplifying. And, right now you go to the grocery store and you just have so many options, and we don't necessarily need all of those options. But it's just in our culture to have access to everything around the world. So I do think a sustainable system in the future would require us to let go of a lot of these preconceptions of what a full meal should be or what a grocery store should have. And you're right, like a very local diet will be quite limiting in what you can get. A couple years ago, I lived on a permaculture farm in Costa Rica, and the couple, they had 9 acres of land and they live off of the grid and eat everything they grow or grow everything they eat. And what we had available was quite limited, but then with this limitation came a lot of creativity. So we had things like plantains, taro, and cassava. And if you give that to the average North American or someone from the UK, they'd be like, I have no idea what to do with this. And that's kind of what I was confronted with as well. But since we were just stuck there, and because that was all we had, we came up with all of these incredible dishes. So I almost think that imposing these limitations, although I think it would be a growing pain for a lot of people in the beginning, can give way to a lot of interesting creations and creativity as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And also on your travels, I suppose, have you noticed that obviously some people will have the microclimate that's suited to growing a particular crop? Some people will have a family tradition of it. Some will have the knowledge to do one crop and not another. So rather than one person trying to grow lots of different things, have you noticed a trend towards smaller farms specialising, but networking together so that the community can benefit from the specialist skills but still get the range of food?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's what will work. There's no way that one person can do it themselves. And a lot of my podcasts and the interviews are inspired by Indigenous communities around the world, and they did not work alone. One family would specialize in hunting, and the others would cultivate a legume crop. And with that came a community where people were self sufficient, but you don't do it alone. And I think that, again, is another cultural hurdle that we sort of have to get over. I think in a very individualistic society that you and I come from, you're kind of expected to fend for yourselves, right? But if we really wanted these truly local sustainable systems, we would have to do community building and depend on our neighbors and have this network. But that really starts with creating a community where you are.
And so aside from collaborating and sharing food and knowledge, are there any other benefits to the local communities that you've noticed where this system's being implemented?
So again, a lot of my inspiration comes from Indigenous communities around the world. And when I've been to these places, you see that then they have a collective incentive to take care of their land because they are producing food for themselves in their own community. Whereas the system that I grew up with in Los Angeles, you just go to the grocery store and the food comes from very far away. So you have no idea what's going on. You don't really have an incentive to protect your land. But I'll give another solid example. When I was in Ecuador, I interviewed the Quichua, who are the indigenous people there, and everyone had their own, they called them chakras. These chakras were like 4 hectares of land that everyone had. And they, like you said, like shared what they grew amongst the community. And after a couple of decades, when the soil was just used up, they would burn and slash and just like make sure the land was regenerated and then move on to a different land and then leave their old chakras empty back then for like 20, 30 years. And this was just like a community thing because they were invested in where they are in the world. And it's something that a lot of us lack today.
Yeah, we do. And as you're talking, I'm thinking this sounds the polar opposite of how our societies, certainly in the West, are structured today. Obviously, we have become rootless and unattached from the land. A lot of us, we don't have those traditions and those community bonds and that knowledge to fall back on. How could we start, somebody, for example, living in the suburbs of London, how would they go about this and getting involved in this?
Yeah, and I'm very much aware that like my philosophies or, the concepts that I'm bringing up isn't necessarily realistic in our society because exactly what you said, because of the systems that we live in. And I think for someone living in the suburbs, it just starts with having an awareness of what's growing around you. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in the United States, for example, grass is one of the most cultivated crops in our country, and it's just kind of sitting there and doing nothing. If people converted their lawns into food forests, planting resilient plants that give off food that don't necessarily take a lot of input, like perennials or fruit trees, that could be a way to feed the community. Obviously, this wouldn't feed a whole family, it probably wouldn't sustain a society. You do need to have core carbs and more hefty things, but it could be a way to supplement. So we're not importing avocados from 1,000 miles away or like goji berries from China. You could supplement based on what's in front of you. But again, like this is a very aspirational goal because you would have to work with your local governments in order to get a lot of these things approved and your local community. So at the end of the day, it comes down to just working with the people around you. And sometimes, honestly, I think that's the hardest part of this whole thing, working with others.
I think you're probably right. And managing the cropping as well is quite tough, especially if you're sharing that with other people. You have to be quite opportunistic, I think, about your opportunities to get food and to eat it. You have to do it in a kind of timely fashion, and you are a little bit at the mercy of what's ready at that time. I mean, I always think that people could certainly, where I'm based in Sussex in England, people could definitely supplement their own leafy vegetables or salads. There's absolutely nothing to stop us all doing that and producing that type of food and then getting rid of the packaging and the transportation that's involved in importing that stuff. I mean, it does seem a little bit crazy that that's what we do. But aside from the culinary benefits and the dietary benefits and the community benefits, I mean, obviously you're focused on the climate benefits of growing these crops more locally. I think probably a lot of us know the issues around importing food, but maybe you could spell those out for us.
Yeah. So the whole concept of climate cuisine is being aware of what grows really well in your climate, and with climate change that obviously is changing. So tropical zones and hot zones around the world are expanding at a crazy rate, and places where subtropical or temperate are slowly becoming tropical, or places like the Mediterranean or with climates like Los Angeles are becoming deserts. So we can't really become attached to what our historical climate is, and you kind of have to look forward a bit or look for inspirations from other places. To give a really good example, LA, where I'm from, traditionally had water, but now because of climate change, every time I go back, I feel like there's a drought or there's a lot of wildfires. And then so you really have to adapt. You can't just grow what traditionally did well there. You have to look towards the future. So an example that I really like that I did an episode on was the cactus. The cactus can be used for food. It can be used for fashion. There are some people in Mexico making leather out of cactus. And it's just a really resilient plant that doesn't need a lot of water at all. What if we added more of that in our diet in drier places around the world? So yeah, it's really being aware that climate change is going to have an impact on our cuisine and shifting accordingly. And again, as I've mentioned, a lot of my work is just taking inspiration from indigenous tribes around the world who they look around at what's happening in their climate and they adjust accordingly.
One of my questions that I did note down as I was trying to think of what to ask you, one of them was, are governments supporting initiatives like this? And if not, who is? But I think that I probably know the answer to that question because I'm not sure it's in the interests of government, who are so often wrapped up with business nowadays, to encourage people to grow their own foods and consume less, especially when you think about the price of land in a lot of places and the fact that it's not in the public ownership anymore and it keeps moving more into private and commercial ownership. So how does that all kind of get tied into it? Are we hamstrung before we begin in terms of trying to get land and the resources that we need to do this?
You're exactly right. There's no incentive for the government or for any big industry or for anyone with money, for that matter, to support this. So we are kind of stuck at an impasse here. this topic hasn't even reached most people, or there are no large initiatives supporting it. So I don't know what the solution is. And I think just this exact same frustration, or just even realizing this, created this level of frustration in me that I just wanted to even start the conversation about it, because I don't think people think of food this way. They just think of food as something you procure from the grocery stores. They don't realize that we can be changing our systems by eating what grows well in our climate. Most people don't even know what grows well in their climate, and some people don't even know what their climate is like. So there's just so long to go from here, and I don't know the answer to that. I really don't.
I suppose the good thing is, though, that you're pioneering this alongside everybody else who's working towards this cause. So it can only get better from here on out. You'd like to think, you're at the bottom of the mountain climbing upwards, but these are the fundamental, important first steps. So with that in mind, what are you planning for the future of the podcast? How's it going to evolve?
Yeah, so the first season was focused on the tropics, and then the next season will be on the temperate climates, which I think a lot of listeners will be able to relate more to, because my audience is mostly people in the US. And then interestingly enough, like the last one is on the colder climates, like Sweden, for example, which is where my husband is from, and just seeing how they're adapting as well. And they're doing things like greenhouses, or they're starting to grow bamboo there. Because the climate is getting hotter, colder places around the world are able to grow more things. And it's kind of a reversal of what's happening in the tropics and temperate climates. So I think my goal with my podcast and this whole concept is just to explore creative ways that people are dealing with climate change, and creative ways that they are dealing with the sustainability issue problem. And it's not necessarily rooted in fancy hydroponic systems or crazy technological advances. It's just rooted on going back to the basics and taking inspirations from cultures around the world. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel here, is my point.
Is your point also that we don't need to invest in loads of things that take loads of different materials to make, and then we have to spend lots of money to buy them in order to grow these crops?
Exactly. Yeah, I think an example that I love to give is like fertilizer. People are always like, okay, how do I get more fertilizer into my plants or my farm? And then I point out nitrogen fixing crops like legumes. And nitrogen fixing crops, I'm sure you know, like they take nitrogen from the air and they fix it into the soil. And it used to be a crop that people used when the fields were fallow as a way to infuse nutrition into the fields. And this is low tech and is just a thing that societies around the world use. But obviously it has fallen out of favor now with just mass industrialization and fertilizer and synthetic chemicals. So exactly right. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel, but in order to do that, we really do have to pare back on our wants and needs and what we're sort of used to in this highly advanced society.
I have a theory that we are so quick to buy things that are sold to us because we want answers and we want solutions to problems that sometimes are quite tricky to navigate, particularly in the garden. You're very out of control when you're dealing with nature, and you're just a very small cog in a bigger machine. And I think that people buy things that just solve their problems overnight. And that's not realistic, but we're sold that via marketing. So we have to also break out of that habit too. Your guests are fascinating. And I just wondered, obviously thinking about your new season, how have you found people who are doing great work? How do you come across them, or do they just fall into your path?
Yeah, a lot of this is before I settled down in Taiwan, got married. I just sort of had traveled around the world. And as I've said, I really do think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I look for indigenous people or people who are really into traditional knowledge, or people who have a lot of experience growing their own food, because I think these are the people we can take inspiration from, because they have experience and they have centuries or sometimes millennia of stories to back it up, and they've been feeding themselves for centuries. So I think that's kind of the perspective that I come from. I don't necessarily seek out fancy scientists doing crazy studies all the time. Though I do have some of those sources, I always find the most inspirational are the people whose families have been self-sufficient or growing their own food for a very long time. There's a reason they've been doing it for a long time, and they know their stuff.
It's such an interesting revolution of the wheel. As I said earlier, it is a polar opposite to what we are taught and certainly what I've been brought up in, the system that I've been brought up in, and hurrah for that is all I can say. But aside from your podcast, if anybody is interested in finding out more, I'm guessing there are so many inspirational people out there, but what would be your go-to resources if people want to find more?
Yeah, so I love just going deep into the permaculture community. That's kind of where I learned a lot of this, or where I connected to some of these bigger ideas. And permaculture takes inspiration from indigenous tribes. So just like Googling your local permaculture group, or if there's a permaculture design course near you, I think is a really good start. Another really good website I like is foodprint.org, and I interviewed them for my podcast as well. And they basically list all the major ingredients that we have and sort of talk about their footprint, whether or not it's sustainable or how it's grown, generally speaking. And yeah, I think it just starts from knowing where your food comes from, what the footprint of it is, and if you can, obviously support your local farmers, because that's one of the easiest and best ways to create a sustainable food system.
This growing revolution has to start with people growing something on a small scale. Of course, on even a medium-sized scale, it becomes problematic. If people grow crops for use by themselves and the wider community, you get into the territory of monocrops and their attendant diseases and predators. Timing your harvests and finding the workforce to pick them, distributing food while it's still fresh, avoiding gluts and gaps, knowing what to do with the produce, catering for different tastes across households, you can see why the convenience option has become so dominant. But it's not enough to do that now. In order to reverse the trend of widely available and artificially cheap food, I think we need to start producing at least some of our own food as the first step, and podcasts like Clarissa's can help show the way. So thanks to Clarissa for taking part in the interview, and to you for listening. I'll leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford talking about clumsy, bumbling bugs.
The welcomed warmth of spring sunshine will often be accompanied by the sound of bumblebees buzzing amongst the early flowering plants. Unusually large bumblebees, with rotund bodies and little wings, whose mysterious, physics-defying ability to fly has only recently been explained by scientists, who discovered that they use their wings to create a vortex, which, like a mini tornado, lifts them into the air. But although this unusual aeronautical technique enables them to fly, it's not very controllable, which probably explains why these bees became known as bumblebees. So as they journey amongst the flowers, they stop to imbibe on fresh nectar and build their strength in preparation for an essential task that they must now perform. Since these large bees are new queens that were produced from the previous year's colonies, and having spent winter hibernating, now have to create their own colony. Already having mated before winter, the queens begin their mission by finding a suitable, protected place to build a nest, which, depending on species, might be within a deserted underground mouse hole, amongst dry leaves under a hedge, or high up within a cavity of a tree. But whatever the species and their chosen location, the queens all follow the same innate procedure, a procedure hardwired into their genomes over millions of years. And it starts with the queens bringing pollen back to their nest site, where she mixes it with wax that she secretes from her body. Then she builds a little pot out of the mixture and fills it with nectar. Alongside the pot, she then uses pollen and wax to build a mound, which she lays some eggs on, and incubates them by vibrating her muscles to keep them warm as she feeds from the nectar pot. After a few days, the eggs hatch into little white grubs that feed on the pollen mound, whilst the queen continues to maintain it with fresh pollen and wax. Then within a couple of weeks, the grubs mature, pupate, and eventually hatch as adult worker bees, who take over the job of foraging from the queen, allowing her to remain within the nest, laying eggs, whilst being fed and protected by her workers. Then as summer progresses, the colonies reach their maximum size, of rarely more than 500 bees though, which is when the queens secure their next generation by laying the eggs that produce reproductive progeny, the new bumblebee queens and the male drones. Reproductive bumblebees that eventually depart from the colonies, whilst the founder queens and her remaining workers all die. After mating though, the young male bumblebees will also die, whilst the new queens nourish themselves on late summer nectar, storing energy for the winter months ahead, and then their reappearance the following spring to buzz and bumble around our gardens again.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.